Welcome to Bizarre Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Bizarre Podcast. Now, if you follow Bizarre Podcast on Instagram, you will be aware that maybe about a week and a half ago, I said I was going to be covering the Salem Witch Trials for our Halloween special, and that is the episode I'm bringing to you today. What I found is when I was researching it, I found that I absolutely loved this story. I knew a little bit about it in the past, but I didn't really delve into it as much as I have done, obviously, for this episode. What I will say is I think I've took all the best elements of the story and I've tried to gather as much information as I can and fit it into this episode. I really enjoyed recording it. I really enjoyed researching it, even though I will say the research was a little bit tedious. There is a lot of conflicting stories. This story is over 300 years old and I think a lot of the elements of the story have been lost to history. So there is quite a lot of speculation on what did actually happen and what may have happened and what people think did happen. But let's face it, that is what makes a good mystery. So without further ado, I give you the Salem Witch Trials. Enjoy. Although witch hunts were not uncommon before the trials that happened in Salem from 1692 until 1693, there has never been any other witch hunt that has left such a tragic impact in the pages of history as the Salem Witch Trials. In those days it was believed that the devil was always trying to spread evil, but it was believed he could not do so alone, and he sought out assistance from women or men who were willing to give up their souls and become Satan's followers. It was also believed that with such power granted to them from the devil, they could cast curses, they could control some animals, change their physical form, and it was also thought that they could soar through the air under the veil of night and meet up in secret and take part in most unholy and vile activities. But before we get into the atrocities that occurred between 1692 and 1693, let me just give you a little bit more information on Salem itself. In the days just before the Salem Witch Trials, it is very important to remember that Salem was separated into two distinct areas. A side of wealth and prosperity, home to wealthy merchants, and a side to poor, hard-working farmers. The wealthy lived in the half of Salem named Salem Town, whilst the poor lived in Salem Village. This distinct difference would cause a rift that took a very dark turn. This quite clear distinction between two classes was also made abundantly clear by what the poor were allowed to wear. They weren't allowed to wear certain colours, they weren't allowed to wear certain fabrics, but the rich were, and you could tell the class of person by the clothes that they wore. You see, Salem Village wanted a bit more fairness. The people of Salem Village were expected to pay unfair tax towards Salem Town. Even the value of the crops harvested by Salem Village farmers was decided by influential people living in Salem Town. And due to the Puritan faith, which played a very, very big part in Salem, people were expected to travel a whole 12 miles into Salem Town to attend church. And well, if they didn't, eyebrows would be raised. The people of Salem Village decided that some sort of independence was needed to separate them from Salem Town's strong grasp. And their first step towards independence was to petition for their own church/meeting house to be built. After a lot of conjecture, the church was approved, but this did take a whole 2 years to do so. But this was only on the condition that Salem Village followed the halfway covenant system that was set up by the church, something many believed was a more relaxed way of the Puritan faith to gain more members. And this halfway covenant system may have been responsible for causing a bit of a rift in Salem. Not everyone agreed with it. In Salem Town, a family named the Porters held most of the wealth and land, whilst in the village, it was a family named the Putmans. Now, I feel this is a very important element to remember because this will come up quite a lot as we go on through the episode. And I will add this, I did find shards of evidence that the Putman family was opposed to the halfway covenant system of the church, whereas the Porters were very in support of it. As I said, there was a kind of rivalry, I feel, between these two, which will become evident as we go on. You see, I believe that some of Salem's population didn't really like the half covenant. I think they believed it was more of a relaxed state of the Puritan faith, and they believed a lot more in the first generation Puritan faith, which was a lot stronger and a lot stricter. But I will say I haven't found a whole lot of evidence on this. This is just a theory I have. I have heard it here and there scattered around in sources. I do believe this may have played a part, maybe. It's just something you should consider. So the Putmans pushed for the church in the village to be built and wanted to assemble a good old-fashioned Puritan faith in the village and build independence just like Salem town have done. On the other side, the Porter family feared what it might mean if Salem village grew any more in independence. You see, a lot of the Porter's properties and sawmills and things like that were also on the side of Salem village, so it meant if they gained more independence, that means that the Porters would end up ultimately losing money, and they didn't want this to happen. So eventually the church was ready, but quite a few ministers had come and gone due to disagreements. You see, the church ministers were paid by taxpayers of the village, and if the taxpayers of the village didn't like the ministers, they simply didn't pay the wage, forcing the minister out. Putman knew he needed a minister the people could get behind and follow, and so the search for a new minister had begun, but there may have been something else brewing in the mind of the Putmans. Something that would well and truly put a spotlight on anyone who did not seem to follow the Puritan faith, and remove any threat to the new independence of Salem village. Or at least, that is one theory that I have. Today on Bizarre Podcast, I will be delving in to the Salem Witch Trials. Salem Village, 1689. 3 years or so before the witch trials began, a Samuel Perris became the minister of the new church and meeting house. The Putmans were confident that this man was more than capable of gathering a congregation to follow the Puritan faith. Now let me just give you a bit of a background on Samuel. He wasn't originally from Salem. Samuel was born in London and later in life attended Harvard College. This was mainly due to his father's wishes. But after his father passed away, he left college and collected his inheritance, a sugar plantation in Barbados. Not bad. In 1680, after a hurricane damaged most of his land, he moved to Boston, bringing with him his slave Tituba, another slave named John, who I believe was married to Tituba at some point, and married a lady named Elizabeth Eldridge, and they also had 3 children together named Thomas, Elizabeth and Susanna. In 1689, he became the minister of Salem. Now Samuel was regarded as quite a good minister. He was strict in his views. He would not let everyone join the congregation. This may have been Putman in his ear. You see, he did refuse some people entrance into the church, but these may have been rivalries of Putman, but it isn't entirely clear, but that is one theory. Now, the church is set up, the minister is in place, and now the events that follow are the catalyst to the Salem Witch Trials. Samuel had a niece named Abigail Williams. Abigail and Samuel's daughter had found a fascination with fortune-telling, and they had secret sessions alone, becoming familiar with different techniques, practicing what many believed to be blasphemy. It is said that they used a method using a glass of water and egg white. The egg white would form a shape in the water, and the girls would have to decide what fortune they saw. Apparently, one day the egg white resembled a coffin, meaning death, and this terrified them. In February 1692, a strange illness took hold of Elizabeth, and she began to act strange. Hiding under tables, screaming out in pain, making strange noises like a dog, barking, and she had strange fits that made her body twist in strange shapes that weren't humanly possible, or so they say. Shortly after, Abigail also started to act the very same way. It was also said that bite marks and scratches began to appear from unknown sources, invisible sources. Now, over the years, many have tried to give their theories as to why the girls were acting this way. The theories range from asthma, stress, epilepsy, or simply just boredom. You see, in those days, kids under the Puritan faith had to act a certain way. They were not allowed to mess around. Everything had to be proper and above the line. So maybe it was down to boredom. Or maybe just maybe they were playing some kind of trick, some kind of dangerous prank. But in 1692, this was not a very smart idea to be having fits and acting like you're possessed. In fact, it was downright dangerous, just a silly joke to play. Now, eventually, the condition started to spread to more young children, 12-year-old Ann Putman and Elizabeth Hubbard. And so I think it was somewhere in the 1970s, another theory was put forward. This theory explained how the children could have been acting in these strange ways due to a fungus which could have been found in some of the bread that they were eating. This fungus is called ergot, and ergot is a fungus that does grow in rye bread. So this can cause severe illness and hallucinations, but of course, back in 1692, no one knew anything about a fungus growing in rye bread. And I must admit, I don't really buy into this theory of rye bread. I don't think many people do. I think it is widely disregarded. But like I said, back in 1692, no one knew about this fungus anyway. No one knew about the side effects. So quite simply, back then, it was more simple and made more sense to say the children were being affected by witchcraft, by enchantment. And this was actually backed up by a doctor named William Griggs. Now, William Griggs was like the local doctor there. He came to have a look at the children, and he came to the conclusion that children are more vulnerable to the supernatural, and he believed it was definitely witchcraft. Just amazes me how they came up with these things back then, but that was the way of life, I suppose, back then. They believed in all this stuff, so to them it wouldn't have seemed so strange, I believe. Now, here's my theory. I believe that the afflicted girls may have started this off as a prank down to boredom, and it quickly spiralled out of control. I also believe that maybe they were working with each other, maybe they backed up each other's stories, and what is to follow would quickly spiral out of control. Either that, or they were being told what to say by someone else who definitely didn't have anything at all to do with the devil, or the supernatural, or witchcraft. It is believed that when the condition of the girls worsened, Ann Putman's father, Thomas Putman, begged Anne for names. He wanted to know who was responsible for bewitching the children. Now, I must admit, on some versions of this story, I heard it was Ann Putman who gave the names. On other versions, I heard it was Elizabeth who gave the names. I believe it may have been all of them. If they were all working in unison with each other, they would have all had the same story. She gave him 3 names, and the same names the other girls give. On February the 29th, Thomas Putman and 3 companions ventured into Salem to arrest 3 women: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and the minister Samuel Parris's very own slave, Tituba. Now, as I said, it's unclear if this was all some kind of setup or a cruel joke or effects of insanity caused by the bread, if indeed that was a thing, which we already have suggested that it may not have been. But I will say that these 3 women all had reasons to be hated by a highly religious community, and there was a possibility of financial reasons as well mixed in there, which we will come back to in a moment. Now, Tituba, Samuel's slave, was already an outsider in the eyes of the Puritan Church and to everyone else. After all, she was a slave, with skin colour different from everyone else's, and she would never ever in those days be held in any high regard. And she also clung onto her own beliefs and her own native folklore, and it is said she often shared stories of omens and black magic. This would definitely not help her case. And then we have Sarah Osborne. She had married a prominent man called Robert Prince. Robert Prince was brother-in-law to John Putman. Remember that name, Putman. A member of the Putman family and relative to Thomas, who made the arrests. Sarah and Robert moved to Salem Village in 1662 with their 2 children. Robert died in 1662, and in his will he left his land to his 2 young boys. She later remarried to a gentleman named Alexander Osborne, and she took his name. That's not all she took. She also took the 150-acre farm left to her children by her late husband. She simply claimed it as her own. So of course legal issues arose with her 2 children, and John Putman also had a hand in the case due to him being the executor of Mr. Prince's will. So the Putmans and Sarah already had bad history, and to make things worse, Sarah Osborne hadn't been to church for a few years due to an illness, and when you're being accused of being a witch,